All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the HCD VidCast. Today, we are going to be talking about facial coding, a favorite topic of ours to kind of go back and forth on a little bit on where is best to use it, what it's used for, and what you might want to be cautious about. As always, I am joined today with Kathryn and Ambroze. I am Michelle Niedziela, VP of Research and Innovation at HCD, and the lovely Kathryn.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I'm Kathryn Ambroze, Manager of Behavioral Marketing Sciences. And yeah, I'm really excited to chat with everybody about facial coding. But first, I'll let Michelle share a little bit about HCD.
Sure. So once again, welcome to those that are new, and welcome back to those that, wait, I got that backwards, right? No. Welcome to those that are new, and welcome back to those who have joined us in the past. If you don't know who we are HCD Research. We are a research house providing market research, consumer research for end clients, and also sort of intermediary clients. Basically, we measure how consumers perceive, evaluate, and respond to different types of stimuli, whether it's communications-based, media-based, or maybe it's an actual product or it's a consumer experience they're having. We use a combination of psychology, neuroscience, and traditional methods, market research methods to sort of get at that experience. We measure that experience from exploration stages, those early stages of development, all the way through validation where you're testing the final product, anything from product development all the way through marketing mix. We do our work around the world, can be done online or at any location. And that's basically us in a nutshell, been around for over 35 years. So without further ado, we're going to launch right into our conversation today, which, as I said before, is about facial coding. We hear this a lot come up, either questions from clients that are interested in doing it because it is a really cheap method. It's also something that some people have tried doing online. You can do it in person, but we thought we'd sort of demystify it a bit and talk a little bit about its application. So without further ado, Kathryn and I are going to launch right in. What is facial coding? I think you got to take a step back, right, before you go into exactly what facial coding is as a methodology, and think about like how people communicate, right?
Right, absolutely. And it's really important to, like the title suggests, like what is communication and like why is it so important to people? And I think the real answer is that humans, they communicate through various different means all the time, whether it be through, listening and chatting like we're doing right now, or through writing a piece of music, or, writing in a journal. And one of the other methods that kind of lead us to the idea of facial coding is people express themselves through their faces all the time.
Right. And there's good reason for that, right? So if you think from an evolutionary perspective, we communicate to one another, just how we look in our face. So if I smile at you, you understand that I'm being friendly and I am not a threat to you. But if I grimace or make certain faces, if you can even imagine animals do this too, they show their teeth, these sort of things communicate that don't come near me, I could be dangerous. Also, there's some other survival things to it. So if I taste something, right, I take a bite of some piece of food that I found in the forest and I make a face about it, you understand that this is either a thing you could eat too, or that you should not eat, right?
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And I think that still holds true. I mean, it's like you said, you learn through example, whether it's your example or the example of somebody else. So it's you're taking other people's experiences and using that information to kind of help your own experience.
Absolutely. Babies learn right away, like smiling back when you smile at them, right? Yeah. So it's definitely a way of communicating maybe what's going on in your environment for safety reasons, but also emotional ones, like, are we friends? Are we foe? Right. Or, I think another one I like to talk about when it comes to like signaling the environment is, if you smell something bad, that could be dangerous, like smelling gas, right? That's leaking in your house. Your immediate response is like, oh no, right? And your face grimaces. And that means, oh, danger, right? It signals to people around you.
Right. That makes sense. And I think marketers recognize that. And I think advertisers recognize that people are, they're working different ways to express themselves. So it only makes sense that they're trying to find ways to measure ways that people communicate. So that way they themselves can better communicate their product or better communicate.
Right.
And
But there's a
connect with
caveat to that though, right? So like, yes, people express emotions on their face, but there's a lot of different ways you can interpret those, right? So sometimes it is something as basic as this food is bad, it could kill you, right? Other times
Right.
it is like, I really like this product, you should like it too. But we have to be really cautious about how we interpret that, right? Or how it's even meaningful.
Right. Well, it's also, that brings into the question of authenticity. So it's,
Hmm.
you know, is what you're expressing on your face honest, or is it, you know, maybe it's more for show. So this is something we're definitely going to touch upon as we go, you know, further into this vidcast.
Absolutely. And I think as we get into that idea, you got to step back and think, okay, where did this idea come from as far as measuring the emotions on the face? And that, brings us to Ekman, and where this facial coding idea came from. So facial coding itself is a methodology, right? So it's about looking at people's faces and being able to categorize that face for whatever emotion the person is expressing. Yeah.
Right, right. And like we had mentioned in the previous slide, that I think it was very enticing to psychologists like Ekman, because the face does provide a lot of information, whether that be verbal or nonverbal information.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of muscles on the face. There's 43 muscles that are controlled by the facial nerve to determine facial expressions. So
Right. So you can categorize it, but I think
yes.
the problem is there when you categorize it, and I think we've mentioned this in other vidcasts, but there's different ways to look at emotion, right? So defining emotion is difficult, and there's a lot of theories as to what emotion even is, right?
Mhm.
And this is a particular emotional theory that is based on categorization. Right. So other emotional theories like to look at things in dimensions, so that you start from being very unaroused to being aroused, from unpleasant to pleasant. This doesn't have that range, right? You have categories of this is happy, this is sad, this is fear. And where Ekman kind of got that idea from is that he noticed a pattern, right?
Mhm.
So no matter where you are in the world, there are certain emotions that everybody experiences. So around the world, all humans understand happy, right? They feel happy, they feel sad, they feel fear, anger, surprise, and disgust. And he discussed these as being the 6 basic emotions, universal basic emotions, meaning that everybody can understand them, right? So we may not speak the same language, we may not be from the same cultures, but your fear is the same understanding of I have of fear. So I can look at you and understand you're afraid, right?
Mhm. Right. In theory.
In
You could say
theory,
that.
that is the theory.
Yes.
And you can see at the bottom here, we have in parentheses contempt, because later on, Ekman added the idea of contempt as being also a universal emotion. And there's a question mark there because there's actually a lot of debate in the field as to whether or not contempt is a universal emotion. And I think you can take a step further, and actually there's a lot of debate whether any of these emotions are truly universal, right?
Right. Right. Of course. I feel like innately, with this idea of categorization for something and to generalize it as large as saying it's universal, there's a lot of bias within here,
Mm-hmm.
because it's it's really like an assumption that everyone experiences happy,
Right.
or not necessarily experiences, but expresses happy,
Oh yeah.
sad, the same
And that's why I
way.
always like to say that, like, it's not the tool's fault, right? The
Hmm.
tool is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Like we tell the tool this is what a happy face should look like, and therefore the tool is going to look for a happy face.
Hmm.
But the problem is that our bias goes into what is the happy face. And when this was first designed, this was the facial expressions were taken from actors. So when you talk about authenticity, is it authentic if I have an actor display what happy looks like and use that as a way to code for the emotion if it starts with an inauthentic emotional representation?
Right, right. Because you can think about it, even just in your everyday life, you might not be feeling super ecstatic about something, but sometimes you just put on, you smile at the people, you do what,
Right.
you can portray as, or what other people will portray as being happy, and you get away with it because that's just,
Yeah.
it's just part of being human.
And when we look at the universality of it, some cultures are very expressive, right? So everything is shown on their faces, whereas in other cultures, you're not supposed to display emotion, right?
Right.
Or it's supposed to be very minimal. And
It's
so, yeah, go
It's
ahead.
funny that you bring that up just because nobody can see me right now, but even when I'm chatting with you on the phone, my hands are constantly in motion because I'm an Italian American. So,
Same. I'm not Italian American, but that's just who I am. I
right.
tend to talk with my hands, and I'm not very good at masking my emotions on my face. And so I'm, very expressive with that. But there are definitely people who don't, right? And there's
Absolutely.
nothing wrong with that, except when you're trying to make them, some sort of universal measure for them, right?
Absolutely. And to that point, it can be interpreted differently based on wherever you're from because of your past experiences. So maybe
Absolutely.
somebody is, I mean, you can use the example of like grieving. Maybe some people find it really, that everyone grieves differently. And I think a big part of that also has to do with your upbringing. So
hmm Well,
it's
I even like to think of it context specific too. So,
right.
when you think about people's facial expressions, the people I actually like to use the most are tennis players when talking about this, because if you were to do facial coding on a tennis player when they're playing, there's a lot of pain in their face, right? And
Mhm.
when they win, they often are very angry looking.
I haven't watched tennis recently, but I'll check it out next time.
Consider it. I think McEnroe in particular is a very angry and expressive player. And it's very interesting that even when someone maybe makes a shot, the face they make when they sort of make that fist and bring it in, right, for the yes type
Mhm.
of face, it's an angry looking face. And so, take a look, go and Google some tennis player faces and see if you just focus in on that face, is that person happy or angry?
Mhm.
And you'd be
That's a great
surprised that
point
a
to
lot
bring
of time it's when they've made an amazing shot and the face is not a smile.
up.
Um, so I think these are really important things to think about. Like context specificity is very important.
Right, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, and I will be Googling it after.
So that's why it's important to understand those beginnings of where
Mhm.
these expressions are coming from, that they're coming from actors, so not necessarily authentic. Because when you look at the system that's used for measuring facial coding outside of having an expert coder, because originally it was about having someone trained to watch people's faces and make notes about whether the person is happy, sad, or whatever it might
Right.
be.
And that still happens. There are
Oh,
still facial
absolutely.
coders that are experts in
In
this.
some cases, it's better to go that route,
Right.
right? Especially with children and things like that. But there
Mhm.
is a computerized system for doing this called FACS, Facial Action Coding System. And it is based on the actors that were asked to portray those faces. So paying an actor to say, make a face for happy. And then the analysis was done to find the facial landmarks that changed from the neutral, right? So
Mhm.
corners of the lips going up, eyebrows moving this way or that way, crinkles around the nose. Each one of these muscle movements was measured and then given a specific label. So each muscle group was labeled and labeled as an action unit, right? So that you can then measure the change. So if the smile is A and nose is B and eyebrows are C, the idea is that a certain amount of movement in A, B, and C equals happy.
I see. So action units are really, they're with this algorithm, they're associated with certain muscle groups, and then those muscle groups are used together to really spit out essentially which emotion that best goes
Yeah,
with, right?
exactly. So it's A plus B plus C equals happy, or D plus E plus F equals sad,
Mhm.
right? So those different movements add together, or maybe it's a combination. It could be A plus D plus G equals, contempt, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where you get these algorithms from. It's all based on these actors that made these faces beforehand. So it's all coded in the system, and then you're measuring people by using, originally it was really high grade video, right? So you could really see all the little movements in someone's face to be able to identify the different changes in their facial expressed emotions.
Right. And I think it was kind of interesting just to go off what you just said. Immediately with the idea of using, the spatial action coding system, it seems like there could be a real problem in it only because your face is literally changing it's changing rapidly, constantly.
Right.
So I
So
feel
the question
like,
is, what does that mean? Because you could definitely cycle through a lot of different emotions within 1 minute, right?
oh yeah. Even
Yeah.
I would say even shorter than that. Like it's really impossible also to know what's causing you to have that change because
Mm-hmm.
you are changing so frequently.
Absolutely.
Except
So like,
if you pair it with asking.
yeah, that's the other thing that we always stress in any of these things that we talk about, is that you can't use any of these things to replace asking people. You really
Mm-hmm.
still have to ask. And here on the screen we still have the types of expressions people have, and I think that's important to address here, specifically with what you just said, because there are micro expressions and macro expressions, meaning those that are these very little changes, right, that indicate that maybe somebody is having a change in their emotional disposition, or ones that are more overt, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these subtle changes, the question I always have is, well, how much change do you have to actually be happy?
It's
You
like,
know?
yeah, what's the answer to that? Like, is that written out somewhere? Because I don't know.
There isn't. There is no, like, so most people that use facts or use some form of facial coding, there isn't a significant change from baseline that suddenly it becomes happy. They just show these changes on a graph from the neutral face, right?
Right.
That, you have happy. But my question always is, okay, so their face is expressing what you've coded as happy, but how much change do you have to have from the neutral? How much more did the corner of my lips have to go up for that to be considered true happiness? And I
Right.
don't
And
think
then
anybody has an
also,
answer.
right. And I would also also add to that the idea that what is a neutral face?
Right,
Like, how
right.
do you know that the face that you've just coded for is truly their quote
Yeah.
unquote neutral face?
And we'll talk about it a little bit later in one of the examples we're talking about, but neutral actually means something,
Mm-hmm.
which is really interesting that's been found in the literature. But, sticking on this a little bit more, is that in this theory, people who really support this theory, they like that the micro expressions they try to say are what reveals someone's true thinking, right? So a lot of times what people are trying to do with a lot of these methodologies is measure this implicit emotion or non-conscious emotion, so the person doesn't realize that they're expressing it. So the person doesn't have to smile, but have a slight change, a micro expression that reveals how they really feel. So some people like to use facial coding or facts to say measure someone who might be lying, right?
Right.
So you might even be familiar with the TV show a while back called Lie to Me, and it was all about this guy who could read micro expressions. And they've taken video of, say, Tiger Woods when he was giving his apology on TV a while back, or any of these other famous people that have had to be very emotional, and whether or not they're being authentic. And the supporters of facial coding would say that the micro expressions give people away. What I find in a lot of that reporting of when they do that is that it's very like hindsight
Mm-hmm.
based, So when it comes to Tiger Woods, like, they found out he was lying, and so they go back and they look for something that would signal he was lying. So I find that to be a little disingenuous to say that that this sort of system could have predicted that the person was lying.
Right.
But there's a lot of issues there, and any of these measures are terrible as far as lie detectors, just to add that in, whether it's heart rate, skin conductance, facial coding, whatever it is, they're terrible at it. Pupil
Right. I mean, there's
dilation
a
actually
reason.
has a link.
Yeah, there's a reason that it's not trusted in a court of law, lie
Yes.
detectors.
So definitely problematic, but that's what's going on in the computerized version of facial coding. So let's talk a little bit about its application. So when we think about how it's used in market research, a lot of times it's used in ad testing. I would actually say that that's where it's used probably the most. And it kind of makes sense, right? Because you're watching a commercial, and do you feel happy? Do you feel sad from it? Are you getting some sort of emotional response? And that's definitely useful to know. But the question then becomes, what is facial coding really detecting? One of the things that I find very concerning about that is that knowing that facial expressions are often just a mirror of what you see, right? So, if someone smiles in a commercial, you actually automatically, without being able to stop it, you smile back. So if you see someone smile while watching a commercial, are they smiling because the person on the ad is smiling, or are they smiling because they actually somehow feel happier? It's
really just more of a mimicking of what you're viewing, essentially, right?
And that gets to the fundamental question: is, are we measuring a mirroring effect, or are we measuring actual emotional response? That's a tough question, right?
Yeah.
So, in some ways, people will try to say that, well, maybe we can take a step back from that and remove the person, right? So let's not measure someone looking at people on a video. Let's think about some other applications. Like, there is actually a study here by a lab out in Holland that was looking at smell. Right. So can we see, and we know that smell is emotional. There's tons of research out there. We all know that, like, when you think about your memories of maybe the smell of cake or the smell of lavender, you have emotional connections
of course. Yeah. There's this association with it. And also there's a lot of research that that strongly correlates the scent or smells with like memory. So that
the olfactory bulb itself has a lot of connections to the hippocampus.
Exactly.
So when we think about it neurologically, there's a lot of connections there. So we would think, yes, you should be able to measure emotions when someone smells something. So they did a pretty simple study here where they actually looked at really distinct fragrances or odors that should cause a response that is one of those 6 emotions. Because one of the other issues with facial coding is you're limited to the 6 basic emotions, or 7 if you include contempt. But the issue there is that you have to have something that's going to evoke that. So if we think about odors, a really bad smell should bring up disgust, right?
Right.
And a really good smell should bring up happy and not disgust, right? So what happened when this happened?
Well, you would think that when you're smelling the happy smell, excuse me, when you're smelling the pleasant smell, you would think that people would have this more happy, expression or something along those lines.
But what happened when they did it?
Well, it was do you want to go to the next slide maybe? Because it does kind of go into the results there. Yeah. It's the idea that liking was positively associated with the neutral facial expressions. So again, that touches on what we were discussing earlier, that what is that neutral expression? Because if something that is positive, is giving you a neutral expression, and then the negative sense, or that fishy smell, is associated, that's associated with the facial expressions, have that thing of like sadness, anger, scared. It kind of also shows a fundamental problem within the 6 basic emotions, and that it all kind of skews negative.
Yeah, because there's only one positive among the 6, right? Only joy. So it becomes very problematic when you look at it that way. But I think the other thing that ended up really being interesting in the results was the timing, right? And it makes sense if you think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, right? So some of these things, if you see here on the top right of the screen, like how quickly people's facial expressions showed up. And so the neutral face was pretty quick, right? Happy came in a lot later, but disgusted was the other like quickest response. And that makes sense if you think about it, because if your emotion responses, those 6 basics, evolutionarily, you're looking whether or not you can eat something, right? So your quickest response should be whether or not it's edible. So disgusted should be your first response. So that makes a lot of sense, right?
Right, right. And I mean, this kind of goes along with what we were sharing earlier, is that it's very much based on your, you know, your biological, like intuitiveness to be like, is this smell safe for me? Is this
Mhm.
smell, you know, something I should be cautious of? Is, you know, so it does
Yeah.
make sense.
And then, when we think about that difference in the orange and the fish, you would think it'd be very clear cut, the differences, right?
Hmm.
But, you look at this graph on the bottom here and it's kind of messy.
Yeah, to say the least.
But if you think about why that might be, well, first of all, they're not responding to a person, right? So they're not actually trying to communicate it to a person like they would if they're watching, a video, right? Where they're
Hmm.
reacting to a person. And being that facial expressions are really a communication.
Hmm.
And so if they're not communicating to anyone, it's probably more likely to be neutral. That kind of makes a lot of sense to me.
Right, right. Because if you're
Yeah.
watching, it's just like you were saying, like if there's not a person that's really there for you to either mimic or for you to try and express something to, you're not going to have as much of a expressive reaction.
Yeah. So if you're looking at results like this, and this is pretty standard results, what does it even mean? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So does the person like it? I think that it's pretty clear looking at these types of results that facial coding is horrible at looking at liking, right?
Yeah.
It should be pretty clear that people don't like rotten fish. And that should have stood out, but it doesn't, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So
Well,
when it
that's
comes to something more nuanced, like two different oranges, right?
right.
Well, how are you supposed to decide which one's the winner?
Yeah. If you can't, and it's like there's no strong differentiator here that can really, you know, determine that a fishy smell, unless, you know, there's always this potential that people secretly love the smell of really nasty fish, but that's not likely.
And anecdotally, we've heard from people who have actually tried to do this, redo this study. They found actually that a lot of the participants laughed when they got the fish smell because
Oh,
it
'cause it
was
was so
so kind of
gross.
ridiculous. Yeah. It was like, oh my God, that's terrible. And they would smile and laugh. So it's important to think, again, about context and
Yes.
what you're really measuring. So I
Right.
think this is a really good example of sort of like the things to be wary of, right?
And to complement that, I think that people a lot of times when they're uncomfortable, they might, you know, show their teeth or something like that, or grimace, and
Mm-hmm.
that could also be interpreted as, you know, quote unquote joy, when there's
Right.
really just this
Especially
uncertainty.
if they're doing it to a person, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
think if the results have shown, even when they're looking at like media, right, and you do facial coding, that if you record someone, you do the facial coding on someone who's isolated in a room by themselves,
Mm-hmm.
their expressions are like pretty much the opposite of what they would have if they were in the room with other people, or if they were in the, like a group of people watching something, or if there was just, the experimenter in the room. You get vastly different results in those situations because, again, facial expressions are social communication.
Mm-hmm.
So what are you measuring when you're doing that? Some important things to think about, right? Some food
Yeah.
for thought, as we always like to try to do. So, given everything that we've spoken of, what is facial coding? What are some issues we see? There are pros and cons, right?
Mm-hmm.
So have we done facial coding? Yes. Do we like to do it? Honestly, no. Um, there are pros, right? There are some good things about facial coding. It's not intrusive, so you don't have to put anything on someone's face. You can just videotape them, right? Basically,
Mm-hmm.
you can use GoPros or cameras,
Webcams. Yep.
webcams, right? And now each of those things presents its own issue, but that's for that cautious reminders side. It can be good with difficult populations like children, right? Babies and children. They
Right. And
can't
I
tell
think
you how
that's
they
really
feel.
right. And I would say that that's probably where facial coding is most useful, is in populations like infants that can't really express themselves, can't really verbally share what they're saying, like we had mentioned
Exactly.
earlier.
Mm-hmm. It is cheap to do, right? So if you are using a fax system, there are a lot of different ones out there now. They make it pretty affordable to just add in. But maybe you get what you pay for there, right? Yeah.
Right.
So it can determine what participants are displaying. So if someone is expressive, you are going to record that.
Right.
It can be done remotely, right? So we said you could do it on webcam. And we will get whether or not that's good or not. And you can integrate it with other measures. So you can be measuring someone while they're, say, watching a video or smelling a fragrance, and then follow it up with a questionnaire, right?
Right. And there is
Put it together.
a small caveat to that I would add, though. Even though it's easily integrated with other measures, there are some measures that would be quote unquote better than others, because something like facial electromyography would take away from,
Right.
what people, from what the camera can see, and that would obviously affect its performance.
Or arguably, if the person had on an EEG cap that was kind of tight, right, it might make it more difficult for your forehead to move.
Right. And even if they're not wearing any
Ear.
extra measures, something like bangs could get in the way.
Or glasses,
really,
facial
right.
hair.
Exactly. So there's a lot of anything that can really take away from viewing the face in its entirety will hurt this system.
And now it's also hard to get temporal changes. And what that really means is how quickly that facial expression shows up after the stimulus. And I think this is really important for like media types of things. Because as we saw in the previous slide, the timing of certain emotions are different, right? So maybe it takes longer for happy to show up than disgusted. So when I see a change that shows happy, what are they reacting to, right? Is it something that happened 2 seconds ago? Because that's important to realize that difference. And that could present a real problem for tracking it if you're looking at a video. We did mention that there's only one positive emotion, which definitely makes it difficult to try to, some of the output that you get from some of the companies that do facial coding is a valence, whether or not it's more positive or negative. And I think that's inherently flawed, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, even to go a little bit further, it should be something that the focus shouldn't really be on those specific emotions, because it's really trying to, like, more than anything, it should be this idea of like positive versus negative variance. And there are better, more validated possible
measures.
Tools to use. Yes, exactly. Thank you. That could help with that.
Yeah, and the data can be problematic too, right? So the high dropout rate, to the point that if you're using a webcam-based system, you might lose like 75% of your sample. And that's from either reasons of bad connections or, obstructions in the reading, meaning like, glasses or bangs or facial hair, bad lighting, the person moves, right? But also some people don't want to be recorded. So then those that agree to be recorded via webcam are a different sort of person. So you have to remember that who you're measuring could change just based on that. Is it really Gen Pop? Is it representative? So you can get a high dropout rate when you do those sort of studies. So you have to over recruit by a significant amount. And to get, valid results, you have to have a large amount to begin with. There's a lot of false positives because there's issues on recording variability. All these things are kind of related. You can't always determine if the emotional valence is genuine or posed, because someone might just be trying to please you, right? Especially when you have someone come in to smell a fragrance or to watch an ad. They might just be trying to please the person that's doing the measure, right? Because you're paying them to come in. There's
exactly.
a bias there.
I would also say that along with that, if you just think about it, if especially for something like an ad, the whole time a participant's in the room, they're probably trying to figure out what exactly it is that it's just human nature to try to figure out what exactly they're in for. So if they're watching something, there could be this this bias to it where they're like, you know, somebody's saying, so did you like it? And it's just trying to be polite.
If humans are involved, it's inherently biased for sure. And often, you know, when you think about the emotions that are being measured, again, it's just the 6 basics. So you are going to have an issue there of the emotions that people typically think about when they think about emotion. They're not thinking about disgust. They're not thinking about anger when you're trying to do a measure of a product, right? And so what they usually want to know is, do they love it? Do they feel loyal? Are they, do they think it's reliable, trustworthy? Like there are all sorts of things that are more wishy-washy, right? And facial coding doesn't have a measure for that.
Yeah, that can be very challenging, especially, you know, just to go a little bit further, the faces, everyone emotes differently, but it's also really hard to articulate what you're trying to say if, you know, when you're in a room like that. So if faces are emoting differently, it can be interpreted differently.
It's not normal.
Right. And it's, you know, strongly influenced, like we had said multiple times now, that it's influenced by things like social norms or cultural differences, things like that.
Or again, just that the fact that the person who's running the study is smiling at you, that could be your actual response. Or it could be that the person in the video you're watching, the ad you're watching, has a smiling baby. Of course you smile back, right? Otherwise you're a monster. Just joking. But you know, people like are gonna just have that mirror response as well. So there's a lot of issues, which is why we're very cautious when we use it. We have used it when we are measuring infants or children. We're very cautious about doing it in any other populations because honestly, we haven't seen any good results.
So just to summarize, really, facial coding, it's not suitable when you're interested in trying to discriminate between something like a product, especially when you're looking at something like positive emotional performance or like likelihood of interest in a product. So
so I think where we would recommend, be cautious, right? And use where appropriate, and you know, consult some professionals. Give us a call.
Yes, we'd love to hear from you, and thank you for sticking around and staying with us till the end of this vidcast. It's been
Please
fun.
link with us on LinkedIn, like this video, follow us, subscribe to us. You can email either of us, tweet with us. We're tweeting all the time. Visit our blog where we like to wax poetic about all these things. We'd love to talk to you more about any of these topics. Join us again next time where we will talk more topics and go on and on and on as usual. But thank you so much for joining us and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.